English translation 469th contact. Monday, 11th August 2008, 18 hours.
Hello Ptah and hello Quetzal, welcome and greetings, dear friends.
Also my greetings for the early evening, my dear friend.
My greetings also to you, my friend. And just like last time, I am unfortunately also in a big hurry today, so I will be brief. But it is a great pleasure for me to see you well and to be able to visit you at least for a few minutes. So, I want to explain to you the following regarding the questions you asked me about Florina. In spite of my hard work, which I have had to do for about a year now, and which takes up a lot of my time, I have taken the necessary time to get to the bottom of things and to clarify everything according to your questions. And what I have to explain in this regard, I think it should only be for your ears and for the persons you have named, because Florina has indicated it to me in this way. So I think that you will not write down the following when you retrieve the conversation record. My investigation has revealed the following. These are the facts to be mentioned, with which I hope that they will be helpful with regard to the decision to be made. Then I will say goodbye again, wish you the best for your health and life, and say goodbye to you. Farewell, my friend. If time allows me and I am not in such a hurry anymore as a result of my work I have to do, then I will come back to see you for a longer visit.
Thanks, my friend. Farewell also and goodbye. Ptah, for reasons of data protection, we have decided not to give addresses of other members to passive and patron members privately anymore. What do you think?
Florina told me about it because, as usual, she was watching your meeting, as it is every first and third weekend. Your decision is good, but you should also have taken into account that you have different officially registered FIGU groups in other countries, and for these groups, it should be self-evident that they have necessary FIGU member lists from the mother. Center Sim Yase, Silver Star Center with exact addresses in relation to FIGU members in their own country. You should discuss, consider, and decide on this at your next interim meeting on the 16th of August. However, the decision should be that only officially enrolled FIGU groups will be given such lists of names and addresses, not study groups. The resolution should be valid in this way, because officially and legally registered national groups have a right to be informed about FIGU members in their country.
I will make the necessary arrangements for the whole thing to be discussed and decided upon in a true manner of right. But can you tell me something about what you mentioned earlier, namely about the bank crash in the USA? Is the worst over now?
No, because the whole thing is growing even more, and by middle of September will lead to the big bank collapse and to the financial crisis in the USA, from where this crash will spread to the global financial world and major insurance companies, from which first Europe will be involved to a special degree.
Yes, then something can be expected. Here I have another question concerning the petroleum extraction. How much time do we have to calculate until the petroleum extraction with respect to the worldwide reserves is exceeded?
It has already been exceeded for quite some time, which, however, is concealed by the petroleum-producing states and by groups of companies.
Is this also the case with Saudi Arabia?
Yes.
The petroleum producers are pumping water under the petroleum deposits in order to drive the petroleum up to the surface. In the course of time, it can happen that the water rises above the petroleum reservoir, and then, in the end, only this water is extracted. This would mean the end of the petroleum production. The whole thing would evoke a worldwide catastrophe because the whole economy would collapse. The petroleum would get ever more expensive and just as prohibitively expensive for the private consumers as for the whole transport sector, which is dependent on petrol and diesel oil as well as kerosene. Through this, the transport of food from foreign countries would be stopped the same way as also the transport of other economic goods of every type. Also, mass tourism would collapse, and the people would have to go on holiday in their own countries, if they are then still financially able at all to do it. The cars, tractors, machinery, ships, aircraft and motorcycles would become valueless scrap metal, and the people would have to go again on foot or on bicycle and on horse carts, etc. Also, many products, like all kinds of artifacts and articles made of plastic, would disappear or get prohibitively expensive. And food itself would have to be cultivated again in the countries, which, however, would not bring much because of the overpopulation, and consequently famine would arise everywhere. In fact, a deglobalization will occur in such a case, which is really threatening, as well as also an enormous unemployment, which in the industrialized states alone could include up to 30%, while criminality and anarchism would take on uncontrollable proportions. To cultivate their own food again themselves in their own countries for such a mass of overpopulation, as is given in those individual countries, which would have to become extremely active again in agriculture and horticulture, is as good as impossible, because the land resources as well as the existing farms, the market gardens and the plantations do not suffice for it, because already too much good cultivated land has disappeared, has been obstructed, concreted over and destroyed. A catastrophe is then unavoidable also with respect to the energy, because residential buildings and other buildings cannot be heated any longer because of the lack of petroleum, just as power stations cannot generate energy any longer if these are operated with petrol. Also, the lubricants for the motors and generators, as well as for machines of all kinds, will be lacking and will bring many things to a standstill. And an uncontrollable disaster would also arise in the hospitals with respect to medicines, as well as to the medical equipment and so forth, and as a result, many people would die. That's how I see the whole thing. If other ways of energy production and other materials which can replace petroleum as substitute for the everyday life articles and other goods cannot be found immediately. However, the two materials tar and natural gas belong into the same category, and are not eternally constant either. Also, the biofuels are an enormous problem which can only be solved through a definitive abolishment. And, if radically effective measures for a worldwide birth control are not taken, then in fact, finally, the greatest disaster cannot be stopped. If all the evil really happens, then a scenario arises on the whole earth which can be well marked as the end of the world, or as the Third World Fire. Now ask yourself whether the clever heads among the researchers and the scientists as well as the responsible, ruling ones are clever enough to find possibilities and to take measures as quickly as possible to prevent this surely threatening catastrophe. They can only do this, however, if they finally listen to the warning and by taking out their fingers from their mouths in order to create effective and far-reaching measures concerning a worldwide birth control, as well as clean and petroleum-independent possibilities for the production of energy and doing things properly. It is also necessary that the people in general reflect and do the right thing in order to correct the criminal and senseless consumption of the fossil resources. Additionally, cars, ships, aircraft, motorcycles, and coaches, buses, etc. may not be used anymore for spins and holiday trips, and sports and race meetings, etc., may not be held anymore if fossil and biofuel is used. The use of vehicles with combustible engines to drive 100 or 200 meters to the next shop for shopping or to one's place of work is criminal, is fostering the threatening disaster, and must be prohibited. Cars should be allowed only for absolutely necessary transportations and other important journeys, though a vehicle with combustible engine should be allowed to go for the shopping and for the reaching to the job only if the way exceeds 5 kilometers. Transport of handicapped and sick persons, important goods as well as school transport of children should be considered as necessary, but only with vehicles which are serving that purpose and are specially marked. And what will be unavoidable, if everything comes true, is the fact that all problems will become still greater and more extensive in relation to the rapidly increasing overpopulation, and they may not be overcome anymore. So the demand for energy and the need for vehicles of every kind, for accommodation and houses, for medicines, and for the basic consumer articles for daily use, will rise just as ever more rapidly as the demand for food. And exactly in relation to the latter, it is insane that enormous and irresponsible destructive exploitation is practiced by those who keep various kinds of domestic animals which are fed with the best food that would be best meal for the human beings. This both with regard to first-class meat, which is used for dog and cat food, as well as also with regard to various grains, vegetables, fruits, poultry, and fish, and all sorts of other animals which would be best food for the human beings. So everything which is done against the evils becomes obsolete and completely worthless even before it is completed, be it through nuclear or solar energy, the power of the wind, or of the water, or through the energy produced by the incineration power plants, or through medications against illnesses and epidemics, which more and more frequently and more dangerously appear as epidemics and pandemics. But also, the drinking water always becomes a bigger problem through the increasing overpopulation, and ultimately becomes a rarity, while the people are fleeing or are being expelled from their native countries as gigantic streams of refugees and invade the industrialized countries, where they hope for a better life, but causing more and more refugee tragedies and catastrophes. Also, as a result, illnesses, epidemics, and parasites are spread and are carried into the host countries, as this happens also through the transport of goods and products. Consequently, new problems and catastrophes are caused for the refugees in the countries in which they had been received. Another evil develops by the fact that more and more sexual intermingling of members of different peoples take place, which in the long end leads to big problems, and to new illnesses, and inevitably to a change of behavior, etc., depending on the scale of that intermingling. However, from all of this hate arises because of other mentalities, religions, and cultures, which leads to evil acts of violence which cannot be controlled anymore in a simple and peaceful way.
You are picking up things here, which actually have hands and feet are making sense, as you have the habit of saying. The catastrophe mentioned by you already has begun to develop. Even if the responsible ones of the terrestrial governments and the economy, etc., do not yet see the whole of it, or simply do not want to admit it, as is also the case with the scientists and the general people. And you are speaking the truth that this global catastrophe actually is threatening and overtaking if the responsible ones of the governments and the scientists, as well as the general people, do not immediately undertake the necessary action in order to stop this already running process and do the right thing.
I myself also calculated this as a great probability according to the law of causality, respectively of cause and effect with regard to that which is occurring on Earth for quite some time and also at present, and what can be expected. One must only sum up 1 plus 1, then the result emerges by itself as an irrefutable factor of reality. But what am I still interested in? Even your daughter Simya has once said that volcanic eruptions could be predicted very precisely without predictions seeing into the future. That is to say, alone through seismic monitoring and investigation of it, can the time of an eruption be predetermined very precisely. What was she speaking of?
Volcanic eruptions can actually be predicted in an easy manner, at least with regard to short periods of time, which probably was the meaning of my daughter's explanation.
Right. We spoke at that time in the context of weeks, days, and hours.
If I have to explain the whole subject in a way that also the simple people not educated in geology understand it, I then must do that in a simple manner. In order to determine the moment when a volcano will erupt, respectively when a volcano will explode, the technique of seismography must be applied, through which in the volcano internal streams, which we also describe as magma chimneys or magma channels, respectively, The magma seismicity, or the seismic waves of magma, respectively, must be measured with seismometers when the magma is spasmodically pressed upwards by the enormous forces within the Earth. By means of the occurring seismic wave patterns, it can be very easily established whether a volcano is in a relatively dormant state or whether an eruption is coming. If the volcano is in a relatively dormant state, then it produces a quiet seismogram, which has long, jagged lines, where the points are short jagged to the left and to the right. However, if there is an increase in activity due to the magma being pressed upwards in the chimneys, then more powerful swings occur irregularly and only in larger intervals. The swings widen far to the right and to the left or upwards and downwards. This is the case with a normal, relatively dormant state of a volcano. However, if a volcanic eruption is developing, then the short, jagged longitudinal lines of the seismogram becomes increasingly shorter, while the larger swings are becoming more and more frequent due to the increasing activity of the magma being pressed upwards. Therefore, the great swings amplitude of the seismic wave traces are getting increasingly more frequent and occur in increasingly shorter intervals, which indicates that the magma is more frequently and even more strongly pressed upwards by the elemental pressure from below, and is released through open eruptions and is flung out from the volcanic crater. However, if the volcanic crater is sealed or locked by an old layer of lava, respectively, or if a magma chimney is covered by soil or a mountain and cannot escape openly, then such an incredibly huge pressure is built that the magma searches for a way to the outside through an immense explosion. If this happens, then the whole mountain collapses, producing elemental mudslides many meters high rolling downwards and over the lands, up to 100 kilometers and more, while destroying everything and killing all forms of life which fall victim to it. If such happens to volcanoes in the sea, then tsunamis many meters high result, which roll through the sea, up to 1,000 kilometers per hour, claiming many human lives and destroying whole areas as well as the human achievements when they hit onto the land. But coming back on seismography, if the seismograms are correctly deciphered, and when the great swings amplitude of seismic wave traces, as well as the shorter jagged lines, are occurring in ever shorter intervals, then the instant when the volcano comes to the eruption can be calculated.
With your explanation, I can understand the whole thing. It is actually quite simple, if you know what to do. But see here, this is the additional word I want to add to the goblet of the truth.
What the truth may tell us.
Respect for nature as a whole, and for creation and its laws and recommendations, must determine the thoughts and feelings of human beings and their actions. Human beings must be in harmony with creation, with nature, with the earth and with the universe, and with all the varieties of existence that arise from them. Rivers, stones, plants, animals, lakes, seas, brooks, springs, the air and water, trees and bushes, and everything that creeps and flees are also desirable life forms, and many of them are also connected with psychic vibrations. And all of them are intercommunicating beings, all of them knowing about their common existence. Consciousness and psyche of all creatures, in turn, are on a journey through time and through the countless manifestations of life, encompassing many physical existences. And in this process, death is a lead to a new birth, as well as the transformation into the world of the hereafter and the purely spiritual. This is the basis of the close and indissoluble intertwining of all life, and in this way, no life form seeks to rise above and rise above others within its association. For in every life form there is good and not evil from the bottom up. For evil is learned and practiced through injustice and degeneration. In principle, through the creational laws and recommendations, all life forms are subject to the coexistence in which each individual must understand himself as a valuable building block of the whole in all existence of creation, and this also applies to every political and religious, ideological and philosophical direction, as well as to the earth created by the creative plan and to the entire universe. Whether simple or fanatical religions and sects, whether stubborn nationalism, fascism, power-hungry politics, terrorism or neo-capitalism, etc. All these directions are aberrations of the negative and evil and, especially in the third millennium, represent an immense threat to all the peoples of the earth. And indeed, the danger of a human catastrophe has never been as great as it is today and in the future. Cynical materialism and unbridled neo-capitalism, which have already spread to the whole world, are already causing extremely serious damage to the nature and morals of the people of the earth, and this damage continues to increase in proportion to the irresponsibly increasing overpopulation. It has already reached the point where a collision of the industrial nations can take place, which can hardly be stopped anymore, whereby then also the states of the third world fall into the same darkness. And if this happens, then a third world fire is imminent, whatever it may look like. Earth humans, however, are actually on the best way to this, so it is only a question of time and reason when and if it will actually happen. But once again, it is time for the signs to point out that the whole thing will be inevitable. But this third world fire can have different forms, so also a collapse of nature, of the atmosphere, of the waters, and of the planet, as well as of the animal world, which is maltreated and disregarded by the human beings of the earth, so simply a global catastrophe. And this collapse then has the consequence that a collapse of civilization takes place, whereby, ultimately, either the complete extermination of Earth humans, or at least a relapse into the hardest primitiveness would be the result. A relapse into the completed primitive anarchy is also possible, through which only a painful vegetating away would be possible for all still existing life forms. Seen from this threatening perspective, the whole thing means no more and no less than that Earth humans will lose all their valuable achievements through a global catastrophe, and this only because a millennium of misguided development has taken place with regard to true love, freedom, harmony, and real peace among all life forms. And indeed, today such an apocalypse is looming in the sky of fate for Earth humans, because long ago the flourishing culture of truth was destroyed throughout the world and replaced by evil, violence, and all forms of degeneration, especially through the machinations of politics, false legislation, false punishments, religions, and sects. In the Christian world, the Roman Catholic Church is undoubtedly and primarily to blame for this. Christianity, as a monotheistic and strictly autocratic religion, is to blame for the fact that after the fall of the despotic Roman Empire, completely new, evil and degenerate schools of thought and forms of government developed, which spread all over the earth and from which all peoples suffer today in modern times. The Roman Catholic Church, in particular, inherited the practices of the inhuman Roman Empire and, instead of the former Roman military tyranny, set up a malignant mind-based tyranny, which found its accumulation in the Inquisition, but has been unbroken, albeit to a lesser extent, ever since. Christianity in general, as well as its numerous sects, dictates in monotheism a tremendous narrow-mindedness that hatefully excludes every dissenter and dissenting believer. In the whole of Christianity and its sects, as in all other religions and their sects, there is an absolute bondage to the religious and sectarian heresies, and consequently a conscious freedom is not tolerated, but condemned and treated as sacrilege and heresy. Freedom of thought that is based on creation and nature, without anchoring and worshipping a religious divinity in it, is not allowed, and consequently, human beings who are addicted to a religious faith are not allowed to find the way to the effective truth of the creative, and thus to the laws and recommendations given to creation, and cannot obey them. Through fear and terror and the threat of divine punishment, believing followers of religion and sects are forbidden the path to the real truth of creation, and thus also the path to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, and are made into an act of crime against God and faith. The pernicious effects of Christianity and all other religions have been experienced by the people of earth for thousands of years, but in their religious and sectarian narrow-mindedness, they do not want to see the terrible truth and do not want to accept that religious and sectarian faith leads ever further away from the effective truth. And with the constant drifting away from the effective truth of the creative, and thus also from creation itself, from earth, nature and the universe, and from true life, love, peace, freedom and harmony, more and more human beings are being brought into the world. Overpopulation is being further bred, and ever greater destruction is being wrought. Truly, the once flourishing life of human beings on earth, when there were not yet any religions, sects, false ideologies and philosophies, as well as no politics and imperial machinations of power-hungry people, and also no degenerated materialism, everything was still largely in order. However, religions, sects, lust for power, materialism and imperialist affectations destroyed every identity that sought to balance the situation, and as a result, the once friendly and allied human beings of the earth were torn apart by endless power struggles and religious wars, as well as by terror, feuds, hatred, jealousy, revenge, retribution, and murder and manslaughter. One of the important reasons why religions and sects are wrong and erroneous in their teachings is the undeniable fact that they all fundamentally misunderstand the true nature of creation and its laws and recommendations, and therefore also the nature of life and death. What religions and sects teach their believers are errors and confusions of the most evil form, and they plunge human beings into terrible, irrational fears, fear and torment in the most inhumane way. But this is an unforgivable crime, in addition to the fact that practically all religions and sects can be accused of countless other terrible crimes of the most varied forms. These include, for example, the persecution and cruel murder of dissidents and dissenters, the forms of torture and criminal courts, of religious or sectarian raids, wars, the drift towards murder, mass suicide and material exploitation, as well as fanatical, religious and sectarian terrorism, etc. Thus, in the course of the history of the existence of religions, sects, ideologies and philosophies, criminal acts of the greatest magnitude and of extreme malice and degeneration have been committed in their name and faith, which have cost the lives of millions of human beings. Truthfully, none of the two-faced religions, sects, philosophies and ideologies are humanitarian, even if their representatives and believers claim and lie about the contrary. They all speak with forked tongues and also act accordingly. In truth, they do not know a humane world, for humanity is unbearable to them, and so they do not tolerate, and if they do, then only for appearance's sake, that those of different faith and those who think differently walk beside them. Although they all refer to the ideal of charity outwardly, they trample on the true teaching of charity as it is given in the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, and by the creational laws. This cynical and incendiary character of all religions, sects, and certain philosophies and ideologies connected with them. Excluding the really good, humane ideologies and philosophies, which undoubtedly also exist, has led from time immemorial to intolerance and unrestraint towards all things of existence, as well as to contempt for life, for human beings, their rights, values, and needs with regard to the evolution of consciousness and the ability to fulfill the creational laws and recommendations. The goblet of the truth, which corresponds to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, makes clear what the true face of creation with its laws and recommendations is, from which true love, peace, freedom, and harmony result. And in the teaching of the prophets, from which the goblet of the truth results, there are references to the creational laws and recommendations, which appear in various manifestations and show that false religions, sects, philosophies, and ideologies correspond to the most evil that can ever be conceived. But this evilness has been and is being practiced in the present since ancient times and determines the power of religions, sects, ideologies, philosophies, and politics, whereby they, as they have done since ancient times, exert enormous coercion on human beings in order to dominate them. All of them force human beings under their thumb, so that they blindly believe and obey the exercise of political, social, religious, sectarian, ideological, and philosophical pressure. But this is ultimately the downfall of man, together with the overpopulation that has been cultivated, because the human beings of the earth are nowadays only capable of using and living in absolute freedom in their consciousness. In the great masses, their truthful knowledge of the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, and also of the creational laws and recommendations. Thus, in order to avoid the downfall of humanity, in the new millennium, in the third millennium, the way back to the creative truth and to the creational laws and recommendations must be found, followed, and thus everything must be newly designed with regard to the learning and knowledge of the effective plan of creation. But this can only happen when Earth humans find the roots of the creative truth, and with it the creational laws and recommendations again, and obey them. The modern age, the new age of Aquarius, offers the possibility of a turning point through the goblet of the truth, through the teaching of the truth, the teaching of the spirit, the teaching of life. But this teaching, which has been kept ready from time immemorial by the true prophets, is by no means exhausted, for outside the known teaching it continues infinitely and never exhausts itself for human beings. Everything has developed in the human beings of the earth into pure power thinking, intolerance and contempt for women, as well as hostility towards nature, denial of the truth of the creational laws and recommendations, and also the rampant overpopulation by which the climate and nature of the earth are destroyed. Furthermore, the power thinking of the rulers and the evil violence of religious belief of every kind have also resulted in an almost unmistakable suppression of freedom of consciousness. This manifests a profound disregard for the natural and also the creational laws and recommendations, as well as for life and all existence. As a result of this, earthly humanity, if we look at the present situation, has been driven to the brink of a global catastrophe and is now in the best of times in the process of finally maneuvering itself into it, if the overpopulation is not finally stopped and reduced to a reasonable population level through birth control. The effective truth stands for the giver of life and for life itself as it is given in the bosom of creational laws and recommendations. The life-affirming creative energy connects human beings directly with the laws and recommendations of the comprehensive creation, and its power fills the whole earth and the universe. and it is the same energy that wants to be in harmony with all life, with human beings, the planet, and the universe. In this form, the life-affirming creative energy is an extremely important criterion for the essence of the effective creative truth and life itself. Untruth, however, the lie, is powerless and hostile to the creative and has nothing to do with the womb of truth, so lie and untruth lead only an illusory life. Those human beings, however, who are attached to this illusory life, have removed themselves from the truth and from the security of the creational laws and recommendations, as well as from Mother Earth and from the goodness of the universe. They are estranged from the truth, the earth and the creative, and are therefore beings of anti-truth, but with it also adversaries against the creatively warm and protective, because they can only assert themselves through evil, through violence, through lies and deception, as well as through the exercise of power and all degenerate things. All the catastrophes of all kinds, caused by mankind on earth, and ultimately also by the enormous and irresponsibly cultivated overpopulation, plunged the world and the whole earthly population into the abyss in a way from which it is very difficult for them to work their way out again. And all the catastrophes that have occurred worldwide, and that have been triggered and brought about by humanity on earth, have only happened because the principle of truth, and thus also the creational laws and recommendations, have been violated instead of following the truly wise path of effective truth and the teaching of the true prophets, which has been handed down from primeval times as the spiritual teaching, or rather as the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. And therefore this truth is also given in the book Goblet of the Truth, of which a first part, namely the teaching of Enoch, was also called Cauldron of Life by the Druid prince Merlin, alias Merlin, and has nothing to do with the alleged Grail of Christianity, which is based only on lies and deceit, never existed, and in which therefore also the blood of Emmanuel Jesus was not caught by Joseph of Arimathea at his crucifixion. The real Grail existed only as a holy place, and in the Cauldron of Life was locked up the document, a document of the teaching of the true prophet Enoch from the 7 row of the Nocodemion. The document was given as a copy of the Pleiaranin Kerikwana, the Triple Goddess, to the Druid Merlin the Laughing One, later commonly called Merlin. Merlin poured the copy into the chalice that became known as the Cauldron of Life, and Christian adulteration was used to make the Grail. But this is not in any way connected to it, because the Grail was a place with a spring, surrounded by trees and plants, where the Druids used to do their meditations. And this Christian Grail adulteration has been handed down from its origin to the present day, but again in another monstrous adulteration, which claims that it is the cup or Grail of Emmanuel Jesus, from which Emmanuel and his disciples drank at Holy Communion, and in which Emmanuel's blood was collected at the crucifixion by Joseph of Arimathea. This monstrous lie and falsification of the truth also applies to the so-called Holy Lance, with which Emmanuel Jesus was stabbed in the loins by a Roman mercenary on the cross to ascertain his death. And since this lance has been holy ever since, and since it also contains immense power, which is supposed to make rulers out of the greedy for power, it is highly honored. In truth, however, this lance never touched Emmanuel's loin, for it is a Christian forgery that was not discovered until the 8th century AD. It is also the so-called Turin Shroud, which is supposed to show Emmanuel's Jesus image, but is in fact the death image of an Italian merchant named Caesar Canova, and was made by his brother Luciano Canova, who studied alchemy. Merlin, that is to say, Merlin tried to teach the teachings of Enoch through his influence with King Arthur. That is to say, Arthur, who was his protege and pupil, and with the pagan knights of the Round Table, but failed miserably, because the fierce clan leader Arthur and his pagan knights could not get along with the teaching. So Arthur took possession of the sealed cauldron of life and sank it into the sea by himself. Christianity has falsified the actual image of the Grail, or the image of the holy Celtic meditation place of the Druids, beyond recognition. And the banal reason for this was the cowardly fear of Christian priests and believers, because they were afraid of the teachings of Celtic philosophy of faith. Over 2 millennia, the whole thing plunged millions upon millions of believers into a boundless disorientation of knowledge and truth, resulting not only in many wars, degenerations and evil of all kinds, but also in the destruction of millions of human lives, many of them through the delusions, lies and falsifications of Christianity and all other religions and sects. But from all this together also resulted a tremendously deep-rooted fear of life, which was increased by the terrible obsessions or fear-related obsessions with death, which were brought about by Christianity and the other religions. The craziest of all religions is Christianity, which claims, in its madness, the one-time physical rebirth of its alleged Son of God, Jesus. In early Christianity, it was even claimed that this would happen very soon after Jesus' death, and this was also true of those who believed in him. For this reason, in ancient times, thousands upon thousands of decaying corpses were properly hoarded in the living rooms of houses, which logically led to catastrophic epidemics, as is especially known from ancient Rome. Later on, Christian theologians proclaimed the return of Christ and the resurrection of the dead at the Last Judgment to be the end of time, and thus postponed the fulfillment of all deception and nonsense to the never-never day or to a never-when. But this in turn led to the fact that instead of the hoarding of corpses, other crazy and pathological aberrations appeared, as for instance the feeble-minded and far-reaching cult of relics, which still today floods the whole of Christianity, as also other religions and sects. The believers are not only literally inundated with allegedly genuine, but truly false utensils from human beings raised to be founders of religion, but also with alleged body parts of obscure saints and martyrs. But there are also channelers doing their mischief, who allegedly talk to Christ, God, Jesus Mother Mary, Jesus Father Joseph, Padre Pio or any other deceased saints, etc., as their chosen ones, and who want to be in contact with them to receive messages. And the fact that so-called sanctified ones or castaites appear at the same time and make the faithful even more nonsensical by causing stigmatization or the 5 wounds of Christ on their bodies through their broken psyche or through clear self-mutilation further encourages all this nonsense. But this is also the case with regard to the alleged exorcism by Catholic priests and other devil and demon believers, by which human beings with very serious psychological damage and psychophysical states of excitement are often tortured to death. Christianity also intervened in the life after death, as a result of which the faithful since the existence of the Catholic Church have fallen into terrible obsessions. The rebirth of the spirit form is strictly denied, and the hereafter is presented as a kind of limbo called purgatory and as actual hell. Contrary to this, heaven was invented, in which a god supposedly has his residence and welcomes into his kingdom all those who piously dance to his violin. And with reference to this psychotic fantasy, the Christian religion, as well as sects and certain other religions, claims that heaven is virtually the terminus for human life. But anyone who fundamentally sins against the Christian faith and everything connected with it will inevitably end up in hell for eternity and will have to suffer endless and terrible torture there. But all people who die, except the saints, cannot go straight to heaven in the process, for everyone must first be purified by purgatory, and this over a period of millions of years, in order to become purified and worthy of heaven in the form of alleviated tortures in hell, and thus to attain heavenly purity. If we take a look at all this Christian religious nonsense, we can see that the whole thing is an extraordinarily underdeveloped attitude of consciousness that could only develop from a sick human brain. And every human being who study the relevant religious writings of Christianity and the other religions and sects of the same or similar orientation must recognize, if they are capable of clear thinking and reason, that the authors and advocates of all these absurdities are and were psychopaths throughout, who transfer their own irrational fears and delusions to their pathologically stupid and primitive, false, idiotic, and incomprehensible heresies. Seen in this way as a whole, the religious and sectarian teachings of life and of the last things of all existence are not just one great error, but an all-encompassing misleading and malicious lie through which innumerable human beings go astray, far from the truth, to rot in ignorance of untruth. This is because, through the false teachings of religions and sects, philosophies and ideologies, they are given a completely false and frightening idea of life and of the effective truth and of the real creational laws and recommendations. And so, all religions and sects, all philosophies and ideologies, and all human beings who adhere to them have simply not grasped the true meaning of truth. All you human beings of good reason and good will are called upon to face the fundamental conflict between good and evil and the degenerate, and to take the side of the positive, the progressive, and thus of good and life. And all of you, human beings of the earth, who have the courage to fight against evil, the negative and the degenerate, must offer help through your sharp reason and your intellect, through love, peace, freedom, and harmony, and use only these as weapons. Only through these weapons you can fight against all the rampant contempt for humanity and the destructive rage of all those human beings on earth, who are addicted to evil, violence, materialism, capitalism, and the degenerate and inhuman. Put up your resistance against all degenerations that threaten life and all existence, and put up your resistance against all evil today, in the present and in all future, because only through this you are able to bring about a healthy change in every respect. Never bow to evil, but do everything in goodness, righteousness, justice, and according to the creational laws and recommendations and their truth, so that you may bring about the final defeat of the negative and evil principle. Do it always in reverence and dignity for life, even when you suffer terrible setbacks. Hold fast to your knowledge of the effective truth of the validity of the creational laws and recommendations that teach love, peace, freedom, and harmony, that you may live with them. Fight for this truth, just like all the true prophets of all times, and like all those people who have done this for truth and life for thousands of years, and who are doing it today, tomorrow and in the future, even if the successes were or are only small, but constant dripping wears the stone. This is the motto for it since time immemorial. Humanity and democratic social orders have been achieved and implemented over time by peaceful people fighting according to reason and truth, as well as many human rights and other values. These are visible and tangible results of those human beings who have fought and continue to fight for them for thousands of years. And if, on the other hand, earthly humanity today stands as if mockingly close to the abyss of the destruction of all things, then it is precisely in this present epoch that the chance of a change and the victory of the struggle opens up. which, however, requires that the people of the earth finally decide for the good, positive, for the value of life, and for life itself. The truth is that with the third millennium, a new chance is rising in the sky of destiny, which can make the darkness of the past warlike millennia disappear and immerse the future in glittering brightness. All that is necessary is to grasp the chance at its roots, to respect the teaching of the prophets, to live according to the goblet of the truth, which the Celtic Druids already called the goblet of life and cauldron of life. Human beings of Earth find the way to a positive, life-affirming consciousness so that you can finally truly live your life and begin to shape your future in love, peace, wisdom, freedom, and harmony. Because despite the threat of evil, you have the opportunity and chance to do so. The universe itself, in its interplay with your Earth, gives you the impetus for reorientation, and through this you can find a loving balance in the human realm, which also leads you to equality and equal rights in the mutual complementarity of man and woman. And if you make use of the opportunity given to you in all things, then in the new age of the Aquarian era, and in the third millennium, after a very long time of missing, you will again attain the whole fullness of life. You have been striving for thousands of years for a development of harmony, for love, peace, freedom, and for a harmonious togetherness. And all this is ideally suited to create order in all things on Earth. And if you follow this urge given by the laws of creation, then you step out of the darkness of the degenerate into a much brighter era. Remember, however, that this will only happen if you are prepared to accept the great gift that your Earth, the whole universe, and the creational laws and recommendations offer you. You yourselves are witnessing your bright future. But all of you, human beings of the Earth, you must do your part and fight for everything with your own means of love, peace, harmony, and freedom to break out of the darkness. But you can only do this when the recognition awakens in you of everything that the creational laws and recommendations offer you, and when you learn and obey them, as it is taught to you through the goblet of the truth and the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as it has been given to you since time immemorial by the true prophets. If you human beings of the earth seek the creational laws and recommendations which form the creative harmony and goodness, with your intellect and reason and with your intuition, you will find them everywhere. Recognize and understand them at every turn, be it in the gushing of a spring, in the face of a human being, in a flower, in the murmur of the forest or sea, in the gleam of the sun, in the flashing of the stars, in the eyes of a creature, or in all other things that exist everywhere. And if you, human beings of the earth, make yourself capable again of connecting this new and yet ancient truth in all forms with all real forms of life, then you will be able to walk a holistic path in the consciousness of truth. Look in this sense, and with great courage, into the future, in spite of the terrible setbacks in the past, the present, and the future still to come. Follow the instruction for your change for the good and positive, then you can take the chance for a new beginning and connect it with the demands of life. And through this, you will solve many of today's humanity problems once and for all, in a peaceful, harmonious, and constructive way. Heal yourselves and your world, then you will find salvation in the form of the rebirth of your healthy and rational consciousness. Heal yourselves, you human beings of the earth, women and men, for then the message of love, freedom and harmony, peace and harmonious togetherness will no longer remain just a great and promising dream, but will become truth and reality. For then it will be realized for you that you will bring forth new and good deeds, thoughts and feelings, as well as infinitely rich life experiences whereby your life will unfold for true happiness. Remember that the weaker all the evil, negative and degenerate in you becomes, the more profoundly the fatal aberrations in your thoughts and feelings, as well as in your actions and behavior, will be corrected and dissolved, which have determined your life and your evil destinies until now. Of course, it is still the case that many of you human beings on Earth who want to follow the truth of the creational laws and recommendations still have to overcome many and strong resistances. But consider that all true prophets also faced such challenges and had to overcome them, and as they were able to do so, so it is also possible for you if you are only willing to do it. Simyar Say, Silver Star Center, 10th August 2008, 0117 hours. Billy.
This is very well written. And as I thought, it is indeed worthwhile that you also integrate these words into the goblet of the truth at the beginning of the book, along with the other things, as we have already discussed. And what I once have to say in regard to your detailed and clear language and to all that you teach and write, concerning the doctrine in connection with your mission, should be a clear and unshakable proof to all ignorant and counter-creating Earth humans that you are really and truly the herald of the modern age. By this, however, I do not mean just a simple prophet for a certain people, such as those who from time to time appear again and again with different peoples, proclaiming half-truths or even actual heresies. You are not only a prophet who knows how to interpret the events of the future, but you are also a real proclaimer in the value of proclaiming and teaching the infallible laws and recommendations given by creation, which was not ever the property of any of the simple prophets, but only of the prophet-caller personalities from the spirit form line of the Nocademian. Therefore, your duty and mission is not the same as that of a prophet, who in his actions is only devoted to one people and its religion. Because you are of a different kind, because your mission is a prophethood, but also a proclamation, not of a popular, but of a global kind. So you are a world prophet, and at the same time also a world scout and a bandsroot, like Nocademion, because you bring the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and thus the creational natural laws and recommendations for the whole of earthly mankind, and this in addition to the fact that through your efforts also foreign humanities on other worlds learn and profit from it. But now to something else, before you can say something against my words again. You have also asked Florina to clarify certain things concerning King Arthur and the Druid Prince Merlin. In my father's Svath records, which he kept about my grandfather Ezekiel, the mediator, note Billy, I found something that might interest you, and it is this. King Arthur, or Artus, king of the Celts, contrary to today's depiction of having been a hero or the like, was absolutely not a courtly king in shining armor, nor a good-hearted and noble hero. King Artus was a fierce 6th century clan leader, a war king, who led his pagan warriors in bloody battles and raids. He was a slaughterer and kept the name the Boar of Cornwall. His knights truly were bloodthirsty, murderous thugs, as you say. Artus himself was Merlin's protege, a pupil of Merlin the Druid for 7 years. Arthur, born 4.1. 469 died 11.8. 509 at the Battle of the Comlin Crooked Valley, in a duel with his nephew, the cunning Prince Medraut, was a brutal and stubborn person, for whom a human life meant very little or nothing. Arthur's wife was Gwynwifara, Gwanhamara, or Guinevere. White Spirit, Shining Spirit. Note, Billy. His father was Uther Tudur, carrying the surname Pendragon, who was already married and impregnated another woman in a most insidious manner, and thus procreated Arthur. Arthur's mother was Igerna, who was also married and was the wife of Prince Gorlois. Actually, the liberal Celtic marriage laws did not overvalue lifelong physical fidelity. Thus, while Gorlois, the Cornic duke, was deceived and cheated by the fraud, King Uther and Queen Igerna could engage in a sexual act. The story goes like this. Arthur's father, Uther Tudor Pendragon, fell in love with Queen Igerna of Cornwall, the young and beautiful wife of Gorlois, Duke and Prince of Cornwall. Igerna, however, was faithful to her husband, so Uther Pendragon sought the support of Merlin and devised an intrigue to abduct the Queen of Cornwall and seduce her. Merlin lured Gorlois away from his castle on a pretext in order for Uther Pendragon to secretly snatch Igerna at night and bring her to Tintagel. A confidant of Merlin, who was also a servant to the Queen Igerna of Cornwall, then administered a drug to her, and she reached a hallucinogenic and will-less state. Igerna was kidnapped from the castle and taken to a certain place where Uther Tudor Pendragon and several male and female druids were already assembled under Merlin's leadership. Inside the circle they formed, Uther and the drugged will-less, Igerna performed the procreation. From their union, Arthur Artus Arthus was born on the 4th of January, 469. Uther Tudor did not leave that matter to rest for long. The very same night he let Igerna's prince consort Gorlois be killed by his own bloodthirsty knights. The plan he devised with Merlin thus ended with complete success, Igerna's husband now out of the way. When Gorlois' dead body was returned to Tintagel, Igerna was already back home, but was now made pregnant by Uther Tudor, and was still highly intoxicated by the drug, and did not realize what had really happened, since she only later learned everything. The sword Kaladvolch, spoken Kaladfluck in German. Sparkling sword. Because it was emitting sparkling or lightning-like blazes, radiance, later Clyburn and falsified to Excalibur in ecclesiastical Latin, was a lightweight beam weapon in the form of a sword. It was forged and finished on the island of Avalon under the surveillance and the involvement of the Pleahranin Ceridwena, a sister of my grandfather Ezekiel. Ceridwena gave it as a gift to Merlin, who later handed it to Arthur, who then fought many bloody battles with it. All of Ceridwena's efforts to regain possession of the sword failed because it had been abused. Hence, she was very angry with Merlin, but could not persuade him to demand Arthur's sword back and return it to her. It was only after Arthur's death that the sword was reclaimed by Merlin and returned to the Pleahranin Ceridwena, after which she left Earth. She had already angrily ceased contact with Merlin at the time when Arthur committed his first murderous deeds with the sword. At Dinas Bran, Castle of Bran, Merlin personally stayed. Dinas Bran Valley was located in the Cymru region, where Merlin, the one with great knowledge, was also working. Merlin's real name was Myrddin the Laughing One. Merlin, the Druid of Camelot, received his initiation when he was just 9 years old.
However, he was not a sorcerer, respectively a magician, as Christianity had attributed to him, but a druid widely taught in various fields of knowledge.
He was also a bard, a doctor, a teacher, a prophet, a historian, and ultimately the king and prince of druids of the Demetier tribe from South Wales. He taught in the West, Occident, on Pleahranin Ceridwena's the Triple Goddess, Billy's Note, instructions, and had great visionary skills based on his practiced meditations. Merlin's father was King Morvran, and his mother was a daughter of the king of the Demetiae. Merlin's father was also a visionary, and these visionary capabilities led to the evil legend within the Christian world that Merlin was a scion of the devil, a magician, a sorcerer. The naivete and simplicity of the Christian interpretation held that Merlin and his father's paranormal abilities meant that they were satanical, and that father and son were allied with the devil and fathered by him. Merlin was born on the 1st May, 49. He also picked up the sword and fought with it. And he used his skills in military operations and as Arthur's military advisor, contrary to the instruction and wishes of the Pleiar and Caradwena, however without becoming morally bankrupt. Merlin also fought with his sword against the warlike Christian intruders who stole into the country through murder and arson, killing off or suppressing the population, to spread the Christian faith, conquer the land, and destroy Celtic philosophy and beliefs. After his last fight, when he was 66 years old in year 515 at the lost battle at Arf de Reed, Merlin fled and settled down in a remote area in the wilderness of Caledonia in the Cheviot Hills, where he lived as Myrddin Wilt Merlin in the wilderness. He lived there for some time and then returned to his hometown, where an old female druid named Ninian, also known as Nimue, joined him and was a good friend to him. When he felt his death approaching, she finally accompanied Merlin on Innis Enlibardzi Island, which he had chosen as his death place. He died there in the arms of the old druid on the 14th of June 542 at the age of 93, and he was buried by the wise woman in a rocky cave according to his wishes. The Knights of the Round Table were malignant, bloody knights and not heroes, as they are presented today. Merlin, being a seer, made prophetic and foresighted statements of which his dragon prophecy made at Dinas Emrys Fortress of Emrys or Ambrosius, respectively, is very well known, besides those which he made in the wilderness of Caledonia. Merlin was already contacted in the year 466 by the Pleiaren in Caradwena, a sister of my grandfather Ezekiel the Mediator, as I said before. This took place after the High Council decided to convey Enoch's teachings to Merlin, which he was to disseminate in order to contain the barbarism of the Celts, so that they would refrain from barbarity and their bloody battles. Merlin, being a Celtic druid, was chosen because the High Council hoped that with his help, King Arthur, who, according to a foresight, was to be born on 4th of January 469, would transform Enoch's teachings of love, peace, harmony, and the freedom and equality for all human beings into reality. The real reason for this undertaking was the Celtic philosophy, which in many ways parallels the teachings of Enoch, whose wise, effective, and widespread approach should be implemented to make the Celts give up their degenerated behavior of barbaric killings and fighting battles. Merlin received a copy of Enoch's teachings, being the first part of the Goblet of Truth written on earth, memorized it, and then locked and sealed it in a cauldron.
This cauldron was no vessel made of gold, but of bronze, and decorated with a ruby the size of a cherry's.
And 3 small semi-precious stones, rose quartz, were placed in the shape of a triangle, and in its center the ruby was attached. The 33-centimeter wide cauldron was meant to collect water from a spring at the Grail. The Grail itself was a sacred place of a spring, usually located on a mountain that the Celts considered a nature sanctuary, and where also a druid's grove was erected that was surrounded by trees and other plants. where the Druids meditated in deep consciousness-related interconnection with water, the earth, and plants, as well as with inexhaustibleness of life. These holy places, which have been called the Grail, were intended as places of meditation for the Druids, and they existed in many places, wherever Druids lived and fulfilled their duties. But at the place with the water source, where also Merlin meditated, a vessel was linked to the well, known as the Cauldron of Abundance, which captured the water located at the divine Caridwen spring. Merlin, the druid from Camelot, removed the Cauldron of Abundance from its place and replaced it with another vessel, because he put a copy of Enoch's teaching into the cauldron, which he and all druids then called the Cauldron of Life. Merlin presented this cauldron to his protege and pupil Arthur when he was 16 years old in year 485, after Merlin had thoroughly instructed Arthur and his knighthood in Enoch's teaching, and after Arthur had fought his first battle against Germanic invaders led by the chief Aella. But Arthur and his bloody knights thirsted for blood and vengeance, and they strictly rejected the teachings because they did not want to give up killing and conquest, whereby Arthur thus became very upset and angry at Merlin and cast the gift of the Cauldron of Life into the sea with his own hands, although he later reconciled with Merlin again. This is the information I can relate to you.
Thanks, that is more than I expected. Some of this I still know from your father, Svath.
I know that. However, I feel the need to bring up something that I find annoying and cannot accept. Again and again I notice that you give me authors' articles which have been corrected or edited by you or by the editorial group, but which have been subsequently changed again by the authors, as I then have to find out from the printed articles. For this I want to ask that this way of working is no longer used, because once an article has been written, it should also be considered as the final version, so that nothing is changed or rewritten. Such an action of changing articles is annoying, because first of all, you yourselves have a lot of extra work by such nonsense, and secondly, we also have more work with it which our translators are not happy about. This is how it should be in the future, that articles that have already been corrected by you or the editorial group should not be changed anymore. However, if this is done anyway, the articles concerned should be published according to the first and corrected version or returned to the respective author person, so that no publication takes place. Once a manuscript has been written, it should and must be valid and should not be changed again afterwards. From now on, you are to adhere to this, because neither you nor we can afford to work on changes that have been carried out senselessly several times, because we are all measured with our time. The whole thing is to be a clear and firm rule with no exceptions.
This is to be understood, and it is to be assumed that this rule is not subject to any exception. But tell me, how many species of life forms do you know, which have developed so far in their intelligence that they can think consciously and also carry out conscious actions and also create technical achievements, etc., as well as build up their own cultures, and which are classified in a revolution of consciousness? Yes. In my opinion, and also according to your earlier statements, it cannot be that only humanoids or human beings have developed, as we are. Yes, already Asana and the Trilans and those who can fly are different forms than we are.
We know of 14 different species of life forms, as they correspond to your question and which I can tell you.
Gladly, because now I have been asked. For my part, I have already failed to ask about it with Svath, and ask it as well as with you.
Then I would like to give you information, whereby I name the individual life forms according to how it makes sense to Earth humans and how they also understand it. Thus I will begin with us actual humanoids, whereby I must explain that all life form species, which I have to call show human or human-like forms in shape, as well as forms mixed with their other species, whereby the only human-like beings are not actual humanoids, but just different and embodying two different species. All of them, however, are capable of a conscious development of consciousness, have their own cultures and languages as well as techniques, whereby some of the ones we know are also masters of space travel and belong to our Federation. All of them, at least those who belong to our Federation, are peaceful beings and have no warlike or violent ambitions. 1. Humanoids are human beings in the form in which we Plearan and the Earth humans, as well as many of us, are allies of our Federation, to which, however, other life forms also belong, which cannot be called humanoids in our sense, because they are of a completely different kind, but nevertheless consciously capable of evolution and have developed their own cultures and techniques as well as languages, as I already explained. 2. Amphiboids are, in terms of form, life forms of mixed human and aquatic animal nature, which can live both in water and on land, as well as in a climate that is heavily water-filled. Asina, for example, and her people are among them. 3. Reptiloids are life forms of mixed human and reptilian form, their bodies being covered with scales. 4. Insectoids are life forms of mixed human and insect-like form, their skin showing chitin-like characteristics. 5. Sauroids are life forms of mixed human and sauropod-like form with a skin similar to elephant skin. 6. Primatoids are life forms of mixed human and primate-like form with a hairy body but in a stronger form than the terrestrial humanoid or earth humans. 7. Condycoids are in form of life forms actual humanoids, but with the ability to move by levitation. 8. Pteropoids are life forms with human and bird-like body, with long neck, face, and beak-like mouth. 9. Hydroids are life forms with human and fish-like bodies, whose actual life element is water, which they can also leave for a longer period of time. 10. Thermoids are in shape humanoid life forms with a human-like body, whose own life element is hot areas with very high temperature. 11. Frigoroids are in form humanoid life forms with human bodies, whose life elements are very cold areas with very low temperatures below zero. 12. Aeroids are in form humanoid life forms with human body, whereby they are poison gas breathers, and their life element are various gas atmospheres. 13. Acaroids are in form humanoid life forms with a human body, but their skin is covered by a fine layer of acid, like for example the trilans. 14. Fluoroids are life forms with human-like and diverse plant bodies. 15. Centauroids are life forms with partly human and partly equine bodies. 16. Faunoids are life forms with partly human and partly various ungulate bodies. 17. Cheruboids are in shape and weight very light human life forms, equipped with feathered wings through which they can fly. 18. Seraphoids are life forms very light in shape and weight, partly human and partly animal, equipped with feathered wings through which they can fly. These are the people we know of various genera and species, that is to say, races of human and human animal-like life forms, which I name in the above-mentioned way so that Earth humans can also get an idea of them. Our names are of course of a different kind, but they correspond to the value of the names mentioned. Basically, however, it is to be said that all the life forms mentioned, which are the same as human beings, are also beings who in their whole or in part resemble our human forms, to which they have changed over millions of years. Apart from this, however, their appearance in terms of the appearance of their skin and its excrescences is different from that of us who call ourselves pure humanoids. But since several of the life forms I have mentioned are probably humanoid in appearance, but different in the outer appearance of their skin and its outgrowths, we call them peregrine humanoids, as has been explained to you earlier. This term means as much as foreign humanoids. All mentioned life forms are therefore in their essence humanoids, which also have a humanoid spirit form and are part of a conscious evolution of consciousness. The origin of the peregrine humanoids is not the same as with us pure humanoids, but their development into peregrine humanoids has taken place in a similar way as with the pure humanoids. Their primeval forms were very small and only gradually developed into larger life forms, which in turn were subject to multiple changes until they became the beings they are today. Such a course of evolutionary form has also taken place in relation to us purely humanoids, because our course of evolution has also brought about various changes until finally the purely humanoid human being was created.
Simyase told me that Asuna is an amphiboid, and that the Trilons are acaroids. I know that from you, because you already explained that to me in 1975 on my great journey. And also that those beings that sat on the roof of our house in the center are condicoids, or levitates, as you call them, if I remember correctly.
That is true, yes.
The reptiloids, are they metamorphoses, beings that can change shape like to pure humanoids?
No, they do not have that ability. But why do you ask?
The question refers to a nonsense, namely to a nonsense of a conspiracy theory that circulates in certain esoteric and other crazy conspiracy circles, about which crazy authors also write crazy books, namely that, especially in the USA, the government cliques and other powerful people are supposed to be vicious alien reptiloids in Earth humanoid form. Of course, I know that this is absolute nonsense, as well as other morbid conspiracy theories that the various governments of the Earth are supposed to be contaminated with aliens. But a lot of money is made with such nonsense, because the stupid believers of such lies and conspiracy theories buy the rubbish and believe in it, and very many of them with fear and shudder, because they see only evil in everything. And with fear and evil, a lot of money can be earned on our Earth with the stupid believers.
These nonsense is as familiar to me as all the criminal and fraudulent practices of fear-mongering by the writers of such books and reports with nonsensical conspiracy theories.
The stupid and the faithful want to be deceived and duped because they cannot exist in the light of the truth, because the truth is too banal, not sensational enough, not exciting enough, and does not cause the fearful shudder that many human beings are addicted to.
A true word.
Then another question regarding Neanderthals, of whom more and more bones have been found in recent years and decades. Yes, it is generally said that they disappeared on Earth when the so-called modern human beings, Homo sapiens, appeared. So far, however, it is completely unknown why the Neanderthals disappeared from the scene. It is also not known whether they at least partially mixed with modern human beings. Do you know anything about that?
It was indeed the case that in the most various locations, the modern human beings interbred with Neanderthals and begot offspring. This, however, was not the rule, but occurred rather sparsely. As a rule, the modern human beings hunted the Neanderthals and killed them to use them as food because the early Homo sapiens were cannibals, and as such they by and by wiped out the Neanderthals. Partly, the modern human beings held Neanderthals as captives, which they killed and ate in case of need for food. Such captives were also used on certain occasions to perform sexual acts with the Homo sapiens, and indeed with both sexes. As a result, also certain female Neanderthals and Homo sapiens bore hybrids as offspring, which, however, was not often the case.
Now it dawns on me again that you and I, as well as Sim Ya-se and Quetzal, once briefly discussed this. As far as I know, however, it had only been recorded in private and not in a conversation report.
Yes, that was the case, at least as far as I was concerned. We actually talked about it once, but we only touched on the subject briefly. But now, Edward, dear friend, I would like to talk to you in a very private way.
So be it, my friend. I also have something else that I do not want to make a big deal about. But first I have one more question. Is the term Starchild familiar to you?
Yes, this is a skull which has been found and is about 1,000 years old. The exact age is not known to me, and which has been described by irrational and irresponsible authors of dubious books and writings as the skull of an extraterrestrial, or as a hybrid product between extraterrestrial and Earth humans.
Which, of course, is neither in one case nor the other.
True, because the skull corresponds to nothing more than an earthly human skull anomaly. The mother and father were Earth humans, and the human to whom the skull belonged was a hermaphrodite, that is, a bisexual, in which both sexes were approximately equally pronounced. The skull is very strongly deformed by the anomaly and looks a little strange, but this is not uncommon with skull anomalies. With skull anomalies like this, it is also a rule that skeletal anomalies occur.
Thank you. Now that is being clear. So we can now move on to the private sphere.